There are a lot of titles in WWE today, 19 to be precise, and this has led to a lot of great reigns with each of these prizes. But just who is the greatest champion of each title? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the WWE title and its greatest holder, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, there are so many people who could have been chosen for this entry. After all, we could have gone for Hulk Hogan, The Rock, John Cena, or even Bruno Sammartino. But in the end, there was only one real choice here, and it was Stone Cold. Come on now, we're talking about the guy whose runs with the Big Eagle carried the company into its second boom period back in the late 90s and pretty much rescued it from going out of business altogether at one point. And even if this hadn't been the case and we were just talking about Steve Austin's run as being during a quieter time for the WWF, it would still rank at the top because it was so entertaining to watch whenever he held it, as that was the run of him memorably feuding with Vince McMahon on Raw every week. Really, so often a booker will book the chase well for a champion, but then forget to give their actual title run a story of its own. Here, though, we had one of the best overarching stories to any championship reign in WWE history. One so good it would be copy and pasted again and again as the years progressed with other wrestlers, always to diminishing returns, however, because the original could never be topped. That's right, the reality is there might never be anyone who ends up being a better WWE champion than Steve Austin. And that would be fine with us. But the WWE title isn't the only world title today. No, there's also the World Heavyweight title, and the best holder of that particular belt has to be Seth Rollins. Now, when we talk about the World Heavyweight title here, we're talking about the one which was created in 2023, and not the one from the 2000s. No, that one had a different lineage entirely according to the company who created it. So no Triple H, Booker T, or Edge here. No, if it's the new version of the belt we're drawing from, we only have 4 options when determining the best champ. And of those 4, the person who most defined this prize has to be Seth Rollins, partially because he was the first person to hold it. But it's not just because he was the first. No, there's also the fact that with his regular great matches, Seth was able to establish that belt early on as being something more like the workhorse one in comparison to the WWE title, a belt that would be featured on TV more regularly during a time when Roman Reigns was an absentee champion. Yes, it's always important to give a new belt an identity of its own, and this is what the Architect was able to do here. Sure, given how young this one is, there's always the chance someone else will come along at some point and have a better reign. Hell, Gunther's making a great attempt at that as we speak. That said, for now, it remains Seth in that spot, and this is a spot he's earned. But what of the women's equivalent, the Women's World Heavyweight title? Well, the GOAT of that belt can be none other than Charlotte Flair. Now again, there are plenty of people we could have chosen for this entry, but in the end, we decided to go with Charlotte as across her many reigns with this particular piece of hardware, she's been able to establish herself as the queen of her division. And considering how many big names there currently are in the WWE Women's division, that's quite an achievement. Yes, more so than a Rhea Ripley or a Sasha Banks, more so than even a Bayley or a Liv Morgan. It's the daughter of Ric Flair who has come to define that belt, as for the most part, it's been her who's held it, most prominently back when it was known as the SmackDown Women's title. In fact, it was Charlotte who carried this belt into the first ever Women's WrestleMania main event in 2019, and it's her who holds the current record for winning it the most times, with 7 separate reigns to her name. Really then, there was no way we could go with anyone else here, as she's so tied to its history now and will no doubt continue to be tied to its history going forward. It almost feels like her belt in many ways. But what about the other belt that was a part of that first Women's WrestleMania main event? The belt currently known as the WWE Women's title. Well, for our money, the best holder of that is none other than Becky Lynch. Yes, it had to be Becky here. After all, with the lineage of this one only going back to the mid-2010s, it simply couldn't be someone like a Trish Stratus or a Mickie James. No, it could only be the woman who not only served as its inaugural holder, but who also won it in the aforementioned WrestleMania main event. Hell, it could only be the woman who took it to new heights by being the biggest star in the industry while she had it around her waist, a feat no one has been able to achieve since. Honestly, it might seem like too obvious of a choice to say Becky Lynch is the greatest WWE Women's Champ at this point, but that doesn't make the statement any less true. No, the fact is, until someone steps up and does more than she's been able to do, this will always be her belt in spirit. And that's exactly why we expect her to start chasing it once more once she eventually returns to television at some point down the line, possibly even as soon as the night after WrestleMania. after that, she probably wins it again and holds on to it for as long as she cares to, because we've no doubt that in her mind, this is her belt, something which should always be in her possession. Of course, when Becky does return though, she's going to find that there are now more than just world titles in the WWE women's division. No, there are mid-card belts too. And for one of these, the Women's Intercontinental title, the GOAT has to be Lyra Valkyria. And the reason we say this is because to date, Lyra Valkyria is the only Women's Intercontinental Champion. That's right, with this belt only being introduced in November of 2024, it doesn't exactly have a long lineage quite yet. But that shouldn't suggest Lyra is merely a token winner here. No, even if the Women's Intercontinental strap had been around for a decade by now, there's a chance she still would be the best holder of it, as she's clearly one of the best wrestlers in her division, something which is crucial if we're talking about holding on to a workhorse title. Honestly, we're just curious to see where she goes with it and what heights she can take this new prize to in trying to establish it. Really, what Valkyria has here is an almost blank slate to play with. And that means she can do anything she wants and write the first chapters of its history in the moment, something anyone would be excited to have the chance to do. And while she's doing that, over on SmackDown, the exact same thing will be happening with the greatest women's United States champ, Chelsea Green. Of course, this is another example of there being only one person to choose from because, to date, no one other than Chelsea Green has held this belt. No, since she won it in November of 2024, it's remained around her waist. How has she been working to make it feel important since then? Well, by taking a different route than Lyra Valkyria. Yes, while Lyra has been more focused on the in-ring, Chelsea has made the women's US title about a way only she can, through her comedic segments as well as some great matches. And that's given this title an identity of its own already, one separate to the women's Intercontinental title over on Raw. Will this be the identity it maintains as the years progress? That remains to be seen. But for now, it's Chelsea who's defined what it is, and her imprint which will remain on it for some time to come, as we don't see her dropping it in the immediate future. No, if anything, we see Chelsea being the Canadian-born champ of the US for a while yet, as she only gets more and more over by the week. But let's move away from the main roster for a moment and down to NXT, as it's there we find our next entry, another mid-card belt, though a men's, the North American title, the best holder of which has to be Wes Lee. Sure, there were many great champs for this one, but in the end we decided to go for Wes Lee. And the reason for that is partially because it was him who helped to revive its fortunes during the early days of the 2.0 era. That's right, over the course of the 269 days he held it, Lee was able to remind people not only why he's a future star in waiting, but why the North American title was so important, as it represented a snapshot of who was going to be the future players over on Raw or SmackDown one day. So great was Wes's reign, in fact, we fully expect that Triple H will remember it when it eventually comes time to book him on the main roster. And maybe this will lead to the game giving the rookie a run with the IC or US straps when the time comes, something his run with the mid-card prize and the developmental brand will have perfectly set him up for. Of course, if he wants to be the best when it comes to the former belt though, he is going to have to earn it, because for our money, the best Intercontinental Champion to date is Gunther. Now, again, it would have been very easy to pick someone from the glory days of this title here, someone like Macho Man Randy Savage, Mr. Perfect, or Bret Hart. Hell, we could have even gone with someone from the late 90s, early 2000s like Steve Austin, Chris Jericho, or Kurt Angle. But while we could have done that, we instead chose to go with someone more modern. And the reason for this is because considering how long the Intercontinental title was dead in the water, it's great that Gunther was able to revive its fortune. That's right, over the course of 600 plus days, the Austrian was able to make this one feel important again, like something which stars such as Sami Zayn and Jey Uso should want to chase. Yes, because of Gunther, now the Intercontinental title has value once more. And of course, it also helps his case that while he was holding it, he was easily having the best matches in WWE because he's Gunther and that's just what he does. Yes, it doesn't matter if we're talking about Drew McIntyre, Sheamus, or any of the other number of opponents the man formerly known as Walter faced off against back when he was the champ, he almost always gave fans something to rave about afterwards. And he did this all in service of making sure the mat remained sacred and the title remained something worth fighting for. But what about the other men's mid-card belt of the WWE main roster, the United States title? Well, the best holder of that couldn't be anyone other than John Cena now. And when we talk about the United States title, we're talking about the WWE lineage, so no Harley Race, Ric Flair, or Roddy Piper. No, the only real option here is the man who truly made it feel like a main event belt in WWE when he held it back in 2015. Hell, it was this reign which gave us so many classic matches and introduced the main roster to so many new stars, as the Open Challenge format made it possible for people like Kevin Owens to step up to Raw and face off against the champ. Really, you could chart this as the moment that John Cena went from being hated by the adult male audience to being loved by them. And from that point onwards, he's never been hated again. Well, up until he turned heel, that was. But even that heel turn won't take away from how important this reign was in making the US title a valuable prize for a while. So when picking a GOAT of it, we only really had one option. Hell, we haven't even mentioned John's earlier run as United States champion, the one he had back in the early to mid 2000s when he was still in his Doctor of Thugonomics incarnation. It was this which first established him with crowds and set him down a path to eventually becoming the face of the company for the better part of 2 decades. So really, the US strap is tied to Big Match John very strongly, and this only makes his case as being the greatest US champ all the easier to make. Can we say the same about our next entry though, the NXT title? No, that's a much trickier one to pick a GOAT for, but we've chosen to go for Finn Balor. Why Finn Balor over names like Johnny Gargano, Seth Rollins, Adam Cole, and others? Well, because as it stands right now, Balor holds the record for longest combined reigns at 504 days across 2 separate runs. And it's not just the length of these reigns which made them great, no, it's also the matches he had across 2 different periods of NXT's history. Yes, whether it was his first run seeing him go up against people such as Kevin Owens and Samoa Joe, or his second run which saw him return to the black and gold brand to have Match of the Year contenders against Kyle O'Reilly, Finn never faltered when he was holding that particular piece of hardware. Obviously then, this has made him something of a legend in NXT, and a figure that anyone who holds that belt going forward aspires to be like. But while many have tried, none have managed to better the Irishman yet when it comes to runs on top and developmental. But what about the women? Well, for the greatest NXT women's champ, we have none other than Asuka. Yes, for as great as the NXT women's title reigns of the likes of Sasha Banks, Charlotte Flair, and Bayley all were, none of them were quite as impactful as Asuka's. And the reason for that is because it was Asuka who won it back in April of 2016, and then from there went on to hold it for a total of 510 days without dropping it, a record to this day. Hell, no matter who came up against the Empress of Tomorrow during this period, she'd quickly be dispatched as yet another victim of the champion. So dominating would Asuka be here, in fact, she'd never be beaten for it and would only lose it after vacating due to injury. Yes, going out undefeated certainly strengthens her case here, but what of the mid-card belt of the NXT Women's Division, the NXT Women's North American title? Well, to pick the greatest of that one, we're going to go with Kelani Jordan. Why Kelani Jordan and not someone like Stephanie Vaquer or Fallon Henley, the only other 2 holders of that belt to date? Well, while they're both great in their own ways, neither of them were the first. Yes, this is another example of the person who initially won the title being given the tall task of trying to establish it, a weight which was heavy on the shoulders of Kelani in June of 2024. How would she do with this task? Well, the belt has been firmly established as of 2025, so that tells you everything you need to know right there. That's right, despite still being very young, Jordan was able to add a huge tick in the yes column for her case to future stardom when she won a brand new title and made it important in very short order. In fact, so much is her legacy now tied to this belt, we wouldn't be surprised to see her hold it at least once more before she gets her main roster call-up, and maybe that will vault her towards the NXT Women's title too. One belt it won't be vaulting her towards, however, is one she isn't eligible for, the NXT Heritage Cup. No, that's a men's only prize, and for our money, the best person to hold it has been Noam Dar. Now, the NXT Heritage Cup holds a unique place in the lineage of WWE title belts because this one isn't actually a belt at all, rather it's a cup, a more symbolic trophy to be fought over. And until recently, this one was defended under different rules in that it adopted the old World of Sports style of the round system. Obviously then, this has made it a perfect goal for the more technical worker to go after, and while names like A-Kid and Charlie Dempsey have done a lot with this, it remains Scotland's own Noam Dar who stands out from the pack, as he's the only man to hold the cup on a total of 3 separate occasions. Yes, it's a feat which no one else has been able to achieve, and the reason Dar did so was because he was able to master the old British style so well. But this isn't the only current prize in WWE which has a unique rule set, as the same could be said for our next entry, the men's speed title, and the best person to hold this so far has been Andrade. Now, given how new this belt is, what with it only being introduced in April of 2024, there weren't a lot of options to choose from when choosing the best for the men's Speed title. But for those who have been tuning into Speed on Twitter over the last year, you may have seen a fun match or two, one which would have been brief by its very nature, as the rule of this belt is that it's contested over in 3-minute bouts. But as it turns out, Andrade only needs 3 minutes to get the job done. And that was why he was able to beat inaugural champ Ricochet for the prize in June of 2024, not long after he returned to WWE. And from that point onwards, he'd hold on to the Speed Championship for a total 141 days, regularly defending it in short matches on Twitter throughout this reign. Sure, like with other new titles, there's always the chance that someone will come along and have a better reign as time progresses, but for now we're calling Andrade the greatest of the men's Speed division. But what of the women? Yes, a female equivalent of that title would also be introduced in October of 2024. And when it comes to who the GOAT of that belt is, well, it could only be one person, Candice LeRae. Of course, like with the Women's Intercontinental and United States Championships, the reason there can only be one choice here is because there's only been one person to hold it. That's right, ever since becoming the inaugural Women's Speed Champion less than a year ago, Candice LeRae has yet to drop it. But then this should be expected given how much experience she has in the ring, and how great she's been just about everywhere she's performed in the past. And she's certainly learned this new style quickly, because after beating the living legend that is Io Sky to make history as the first champ, there really hasn't been anyone who's come close to beating her yet. Yes, at the rate Candice is currently going at, she could be Women's Speed Champion for a long time to come. But let's move away from singles belts for now and over to tag team belts instead, as there are plenty of them in WWE at the moment. And perhaps the most prized of all would be the WWE Tag Team titles. Who are the greatest champs here? Who else but the Usos? Now, there have obviously been a lot of great tag teams to appear in WWE over the years. Even in the present day, duos like DIY and the Motor City Machine Guns have been keeping the flag of tag team wrestling alive on SmackDown, where these particular belts are currently fought over. But neither of those are the ones we're going with as the greatest champs. No, that honor could only go to the duo made up of Jimmy and Jey Uso. Why is this? Well, ever since the lineage of these prizes began back in September of 2016, they've been completely synonymous with them, holding them a total of 5 times. And one of those reigns just so happens to be a record setter, as it lasted for 622 days and saw them be unified with the other set of tag titles over on Raw. So there could be no one else we could choose here other than the Usos, as they're so much of what tag team wrestling has been in WWE over the last decade or so. Sure, they may not be partners right now as of the time of this video's recording, but we expect that they will team up again before all is said and done once more and win the gold. The only question is whether it'll be these belts or the other ones they snag, the World Tag Team titles, the ones whose current greatest champion are the New Day. Again, this one seemed like an obvious choice because while the World Tag Team titles have been held by a lot of great duos ever since they were first introduced back in October of 2002, we're talking about teams like The Shield, the Dudley Boys, or just about any combination of the SmackDown 6 you can think of. None of those pairings have anything on the trio then made up of Big E, Kofi Kingston, and Xavier Woods. No, if the Usos have been the #1 tag team in WWE over the last 20 years, then the New Day have been 1A, and so much of their legacy has been tied to the World Tag Team titles. After all, it's those belts they held a total of 4 times while all 3 men were still in the group. And it's those belts they at one point carried around their collective waists for a full 484 days, what was at the time a record-setting title reign in length. Hell, we fully expect that even if they are now a duo, Xavier and Kofi will go on to hold these again at some point and only further solidify their case to be the best to ever hold those belts. Or who knows, maybe they'll choose to go after another set of tag titles instead, a set of belts that they once held briefly and which give the tag team division on NXT something to fight over. Of course, these belts are the NXT tag team titles, and when it comes to the best team to ever hold them, well, that would have to be the Revival. Yes, they might be better known today as FTR, but back in the mid-2010s, the duo made up of men then known as Scott Dawson and Dash Wilder was still coming to grips with being a team, and that's because they'd only just been put together by Triple H. Luckily for them, though, they quickly found they had instant chemistry together. And it also helped them that they were around right as the NXT tag division was about to explode in quality, what with teams such as DIY, American Alpha, and the War Raiders also rising to the forefront here. Of course, for as great as those other teams were, though, none none were quite as good as the Revival, and that's because with their throwback style, they felt like the second coming of the Brainbusters or the Midnight Express, a true classic duo who knew exactly how to maximize everything they did in a tag team setting. But what about the women? They have a tag division in WWE too, right? Why, yes they do, and they also have their own set of titles. But who are the greatest when it comes to the WWE Women's Tag Team titles? Well, that could only be the Boss and Hug Connection. Yes, this was the duo that had been campaigning WWE for years to create women's tag belts, something which largely led to them being introduced in 2019. And not only were Sasha and Bayley the inaugural champions, but they'd also go on to hold the belts again in 2020 for a second reign, with the duo being one of the few bright spots during the Thunderdome era. But then when we're talking about Sasha Banks and Bayley, being great is just another day at the office, just as it is for every other performer we've looked at today, because they've each shown that if you can tie yourself to one belt strongly enough, then your legacy will be set forever.